Yesterday, Jim Jordan lost the vote for Speaker by 20 votes. Or I should say he had 20 votes against him. Today, he has 22 votes against him, so the number went up, not down. If you subscribe to the show notes email, I actually wrote some thoughts out for Philip to put in there today, and I want to walk you through a number of those. First of all, did conservative groups get amnesia? Now, I have had amnesia. True story. I have had amnesia. And it is a freaky thing to this day to even talk about. 2 years ago now, so it was 2020, Christmas of 2021? No, 2020. So almost 3 years ago now. Sorry, I had amnesia. Have trouble remembering when it happened. 2 days after Christmas, I remember this distinctly. 2 days after Christmas, I went to the driving range with my son. I got brand new PXG golf clubs. That was my Christmas present. I wanted to get out to the driving range and practice with him. I took my son, who's a lefty. He had some clubs. I was trying to help him with the swing. I was standing in front of him. I got the full force of the forward swing into the side of my head. I have a divot in my head. So here's the craziest thing about this. A neurologist told me, like most sports injuries are to the front or the top of your head or the back, and that you don't remember the incident, that if they're to the side of your head, you can remember the incident and other stuff is foggy. I telling the truth, because I got hit on the side of my head, and I remember the incident. I remember like the dull thud. I'm getting a little queasy just thinking about it, honestly. And I remember I put my hand on my head. There's a little bit of blood. I told my son we probably need to go. So we headed home, and he was real quiet. And I looked at he was very quiet. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and he was staring at me in the rearview mirror, and there was blood pouring out of the side of my head, all down my face. It was all over my shirt. I didn't even feel it. It didn't hurt. So I called my wife, and I said, we had an accident. Could you get a cold washcloth and some ice ready for when we get home? She thought it was my kid. So the kid gets out of the car and is running to the house. My wife is trying to grab him to make sure he's okay. She looks at him and he's okay. He says, what's the problem? Well, I get out of the car. Takes me a minute to get out of the car. And I head to the bathroom, and she comes following in behind me. And she says, are you okay? And I turn around, and I am covered in blood. And that is the last thing I remember. I distinctly remember saying, I think I need and it's like the record stopped. I do not have a memory of the next 2 weeks of my life. I don't remember anything. So Philip, his brother, came over the next Sunday night. This was on, I think, a Tuesday or a Wednesday. I can't really remember. Philip's brother came over that following Sunday. We were watching football on the front porch. I have no recollection to this day of that man ever being on my front porch, but my security camera shows I engaged in a conversation with him. And at one point, I became very belligerent that we were at halftime, and I didn't remember the start of the game, but it was actually the start of the game, and I was a belligerent a-hole. I don't remember any of that. I don't remember anything. In fact, the horror story of all of this is that I wound up feeling well enough to go back to radio the next day, and I did 3 days of radio until my boss at the time, Drew, calls to tell me how good I sounded, and I have no recollection to this day of having done any radio whatsoever. He made me go home until a doctor cleared me for the next week. I do not remember doing 3 days of radio, but I could listen. You would never know. This is how good at radio I am, people. Y'all would never know I had amnesia and had no idea what I was doing in my life at the moment. The radio sounded really good. You can pull up the podcast from those days of radio, and I was brilliant. And I have no memory whatsoever of doing it. None. It is the wildest thing to have like 2 weeks of your life and you don't remember anything. It's insane. I was on the golf course a while back, and apparently one of the doctors who attended to me came up and started talking to me, and I'm like, I don't know who this guy is. He clearly knew who I was, and he finally laughed. He's like, oh, yeah, you wouldn't remember me, would you? It's crazy. Like when you're a kid and you watch a TV show and the people have amnesia, it's kind of like this wild thing. Like, are they just making this up? Is this a real thing? It's a real thing. And I got to wonder, does the conservative movement have amnesia? Did my kid collectively hit the conservative movement with a golf club in the back of the side of the head? I ask because when we fought John Boehner, and when we fought Kevin McCarthy the first time and wound up with Paul Ryan, and when we fought Mitch McConnell, the lesson that we learned each of those times was that when the conservative movement mobilizes against these internal congressional fights, we lose. Every single time the conservative movement has mobilized against an intra-party, internal to Congress fight, the conservative movement has lost. The only time we won was this fight with Kevin McCarthy back in January. And there was a fundamental difference between it and the others. So what's the difference between them? Well, the difference is when the conservative movement rallies their base to call members of Congress, the biblical donkeys show up. They don't just call and say, hi, my name's Eric Erickson. I'm a constituent. I really like Jim Jordan, and I hope you'll consider voting for him. They don't do that. If they did, they might win. But there are too many a-holes in the conservative movement who call up and say, if you don't vote for Jim Jordan, I'm going to fight against you. You better vote against Jim Jordan. If you don't vote for Jim Jordan, I'm going to primary you. I'm going to show up at your house. I'm going to bully you. Folks, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We learned that with John Boehner. We learned that with Kevin McCarthy the first time. We learned that in the fight against John McConnell. Or John McConnell's my agent, Mitch McConnell. We learned that every single time. You have these a-holes in the conservative movement who start calling. Somebody anonymously texted Don Bacon's wife, Don Bacon, member of Congress from Nebraska. Somebody started anonymously texting his wife to bully her about her husband voting for Jim Jordan. Of course he didn't vote for Jim Jordan. He wasn't going to anyway, but it made him more dogmatic. He wasn't even going to consider a vote for Jim Jordan after being bullied. It happens every time. How does the conservative movement forget this every time? Do you know the difference between those fights and the one we had with McCarthy in January? With McCarthy in January, here's what happened. Chip Roy, the congressman from Texas, got a bunch of conservative congressmen in a room off-site, and they plotted it out after the election in November. They had 2 months planning time. They kept it close to the vest. They kept it internal. I was one of the very few people on the outside who knew what was going to happen. And they didn't rally the base. They didn't rally people to make a bunch of phone calls. They did it internally. They plotted it out. They did it over 2 months. Matt Gaetz showed up on the floor of the House. Leroy Jenkins blew it all up, got rid of Kevin McCarthy, and now guess what? He sabotaged Jim Jordan in the process. Had Matt Gaetz waited, put a little thought into it, and plotted with other conservatives, they probably could have expanded the number of people to vote against Jim Jordan or against Kevin McCarthy and gotten Jim Jordan the speakership. But he didn't want to do that. All of this that happened today, killing off Jim Jordan's opportunity to be speaker, is because Matt Gaetz had no impulse control, didn't wait, and decided to Leroy Jenkins it. If you don't know who Leroy Jenkins is, you are missing out on a brilliant moment of pop culture. But also, how was Jim Jordan's whip operation so bad? I was talking to him 2 days ago, and they thought that they were down to like 6 holdouts. They had 20 the first day, 22 the second day. How is that possible? How is it so bad? And then they turned and started stabbing Steve Scalise in the back. Scalise stood up, voted for Jordan, got applause for doing so. And then after the vote failed, the Jordan people immediately started blasting Scalise. So guess what? People who were Scalise supporters who voted for Jordan, they turned on him. They turned on Jordan. There's something else here as well. Ken Buck is a good dude. Ken Buck is a good friend. Ken Buck is a principled conservative. And Ken Buck refused to support Scalise or Jordan because neither man would come out and say the 2020 election wasn't stolen. Ken Buck is a conservative who understands that to be in the majority, we have to have moderates. And to have moderates, you can't have election deniers as Speaker of the House. Forget the wrestling scandal with Jim Jordan. Just the ties to Trump and trying to get Mike Pence to throw out the Electoral College. Moderates in New York, whose seats we need to stay in the majority, would be crucified if they voted for Jim Jordan. And if they went on television, if he was the speaker, before they could talk about anything else, they would have to talk about the stolen election. And Buck made that point repeatedly, and he couldn't get Jordan to walk it back, and so he didn't vote for Jordan. Don't blame Ken Buck here. Ken Buck is making a ton of sense. Here's the difference between so many conservatives in Washington and the progressive Hamas caucus squad. The Hamas caucus squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Atlanta Presley, and the like, they know they got to be in the majority to get anything done. And so they're team players with Nancy Pelosi, even as they don't like her, even as they wish she was even further left than she already is. They don't like her, but they know they need her. They need the majority to get things done. Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Nancy Mace, these conservative bomb throwers, if they're in the minority, they still raise money. They don't have to be in the majority to get anything done. They can rather rule in hell than worship in heaven. They don't need to do it. It's just remarkable that Matt Gaetz went in Leroy Jenkins style and threw this bomb, and he's taken out Jim Jordan. And by the way, yes, Matt Gaetz bears the lion's share of responsibility here. He went in Leroy Jenkins style. He didn't play. Now, for those of you who don't know what Leroy Jenkins is, I can't play you the audio because of the profanity in it, but Leroy Jenkins is a very famous video of a group of guys playing World of Warcraft. And Leroy is one of the players in the game. And all the guys are plotting out how they're going to go into this cave and they're going to wipe out the bad guys. And Leroy steps out to go to the bathroom. And while Leroy's in the bathroom, the rest of the guys are plotting. All right, we've lost every time we've done this, so we're going to shake up the strategy. Here's what we're going to do. 3 of us are going to go into the front door. We're going to draw attention. We're going to try to draw back and run them out of the cave. The other 5 of you, you're going to go around the back side of the cave. You're going to break down the rocks. You're going to get in from the backside. And as these guys are charging us, y'all shoot them from behind. Now, be careful. Don't shoot us. Now, we're going to leave 3 other guys out in case we get injured or hurt. These other 3 guys, they're going to be the backup. And so they're laying out this plot. And all of a sudden, Leroy comes back in here and say, all right, guys, I'm back. Let's go. Leroy Jenkins. And he runs in and they all die again. He did not sit down, didn't plot, he just Leroy Jenkinsed it. That's what Matt Gaetz did. He didn't sit, he didn't plot. Look what happened with Kevin McCarthy in January. For 2 months, conservatives led by Chip Roy, they laid out a scheme where, look, if we can't get this, we're at least going to extract maximum concessions from Kevin McCarthy to get conservatives on the Rules Committee for the first time ever and conservatives on the Appropriations Committee for the first time ever. And they won. They got everything they wanted. Kevin McCarthy became Speaker, which is what he wanted. You had this alliance. It worked. Matt Gaetz, Leroy Jenkinsed it. He killed off Kevin McCarthy's speakership, and he's just sabotaged Jim Jordan's speakership. And conservatives are probably going to find a more moderate speaker now, who, by the way, is going to make sure Ukraine is funded. I'm sure you all wanted that.